Hi, I'm Michael Gropper from the University of California, San Francisco. What I'm going to talk to you about now is something that's been a real challenge for anybody in really for the whole pandemic, but certainly those that are in a leadership role. This is a challenge that actually started before the pandemic, as I have been chair now about 7 years of a big department, about 500 people. And as I've thought about how do you manage a department that's very diverse in every way, and I'm very proud of that, one of the interesting things is how do you manage people that come from different generations? My disclosures are the same. I receive royalties from Elsevier for the Miller textbook, and also my spouse is an officer and shareholder in Kindbody, which is a women's health company, which I will not talk about. So here's another disclosure. I'm a card-carrying baby boomer, not afraid. Here I am in high school, Lowell High School in San Francisco, and here I am now, an older, as we say, cisgendered white guy. And so I have to disclose that that's my perspective, and as I navigate my way as chair and trying to manage a group, I have to keep this in mind. So I think we're all experiencing, especially since the pandemic, the challenges of a physician shortage. We are very short in San Francisco. I'm hiring 30 additional faculty over the next year, nurse anesthetists, et cetera. And there have been many of our colleagues that have left the workforce. This is occurring at a time when the population is growing, as you can see here, and particularly the elderly population, those over age 75, and they will need a lot of healthcare. And so we have a real challenge of how are we going to take care of these patients? And how can we actually retain our current workforce so that they don't leave healthcare, and so that we will be able to take care of these patients? But there is a huge physician shortage. This is a study from the AAMC showing that physicians in general, and also surgeons, and of course also anesthesiologists, there's a substantial shortage. So how do we maintain the workforce that we have, which is of course the easiest way to provide care for all these patients, as opposed to having to quickly train, which is of course not possible given how much time it takes to train new people and get these people to be able to take care of patients. So Gaswork is a website where people look for anesthesia jobs. I've only had one anesthesia job my whole life. I haven't done that. But I actually gave this talk in the fall, and I looked at the Gaswork, and at that time in October 29th, there were 3,100 anesthesia jobs, 6,500 CRNA jobs, and a handful of anesthesia assistant jobs. I just looked at it again earlier recently, and in fact, it's gone up even higher. Now 3,800 anesthesia jobs and 7,500 CRNA jobs. And so there are more and more jobs suggesting both increasing demand, but also some people leaving the workforce. And certainly in my role in an academic department, it's challenging because in the communities around San Francisco, they're offering very high salaries for anesthesiologists. And I worry that some of my faculty will leave. Well, as I've said, the COVID pandemic has led to departures from the workforce. But of course, we all know that there is a significant problem with burnout. And the Mayo Clinic did a nice study that looked at burnout in healthcare workers. And really what was interesting was they looked at burnout as a function of response to a survey was, do you feel valued by your healthcare institution? And the burnout was much higher, of course, by those that didn't feel valued. So the question that I ask myself, and I spend a lot of time, money, and effort on, is how do I make my workforce feel valued? Well, this occurred to me, this was a couple of years ago, actually, when I work in the operating room 1 or 2 days a week. I usually do thoracic cases. And as you know, we have the residents page the attending the night before the case to go over the case and come up with a plan. And so a resident paged me. I was still on a Zoom meeting or whatever I was doing at that time. And I texted back and said, well, can we talk around 7? And the resident said, well, I'm going to Soul Cycle. How about 9? And I was taken aback a little bit. And the question is, what should my reaction be? It's a Soul Cycle. It's obviously just a little bit before the pandemic, but it's opening up again. Should I be annoyed that the resident is being disrespectful to me? In other words, I would have been terribly frightened not to call Ron Miller back right away. Or should I be happy that the resident is exercising and reducing stress and burnout? Or am I just jealous that, boy, I'd like to be doing that, and the resident has time to work out and I don't? So this was really interesting to me as I thought about what my reaction should be to that, because this is very much a generational thing. Well, as you know, we have a huge range of ages, and the people that were working with us in the OR yesterday with a great resident who I think is maybe in her, I guess, late 20s. I didn't ask. And then, of course, I have faculty that are 70 plus. So a large range. And of course, in the whole workforce team that we work with, this is a multi-generational team. And that's a great thing, but we have to understand, particularly someone like myself who's at the far end of that, how do I manage that team? Well, it turns out that the generations are really defined by major events. There's the traditionalists, or sometimes what was called the greatest generation. And those are really people coming out of World War II. Those are disappearing pretty fast, but they saw great prosperity after World War II. The baby boomers, of which as I am a member, saw prosperity after the war, but lived through some difficult events, the assassinations of JFK and Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the start of the free speech movement, certainly in California, and that really originated in Berkeley, and then really the rejection of institutions. Gen X lived through Watergate, the Iran hostage crisis, the falling of the Berlin Wall, and the Gulf War. And in fact, this was an important time, because we've certainly lived through this more recently, which is skepticism about institutions. In other words, maybe we don't trust the government so much anymore. The government was great getting us to World War II, not so much because of the Gulf War and the idea of are we being told the truth? And there's some wariness of baby boomers. The millennials that I'm going to talk a fair amount about, because that's a big part of our workforce, has been formed by the rise of the internet and social media, but also lived through 9/11. Subsequently, Gen Z, which is becoming a larger part of our workforce, had to live through the post 9/11 time, the war on terror, changes in our lives as a result of that, but also constant connection with the advent of cell phones, or of smartphones rather, and the need for instant connection and communication. The idea that when you want to talk to somebody, you should be able to communicate with them immediately. And the real interesting, as I thought about this talk, was how will the next generation be impacted by the really remarkable and difficult couple of years we've had around COVID-19, of course, the war in Ukraine, and the great realization about the threat of global warming has really come home to roost. So one of the things that you could do, as I thought about that when I first prepared this talk, was something that I was reading about Jack Welch, the CEO of GE. Sorry, it's a typo, not GM. And he realized that as an older male, that he wasn't really connected to the people on the front lines. He didn't understand them. So he went to the assembly line where they're making televisions or jet engines at GE. And he asked a younger person, would they be their reverse mentor? And as you think about a reverse mentor, this is someone who is from a different generation. Perhaps they're of a different LGBTQ status or a different race or ethnicity, you can get to know, and that can help you understand the expectations and rules of that generation. So I asked one of our chief residents at the time, Danny Laufer, who's now a faculty member at cardiothoracic anesthesia and critical care, and she said, sure. And in fact, this has been very valuable. I'm moving on to a new reverse mentor, and this has been very valuable to me. So the workplace has changed. And, I have worked at as I said, I've had one job in anesthesia. I will likely finish my career in the same place where I started it. I have a pension, something that people don't really see anymore, or what we call the golden handcuffs, but very little movement between jobs in my generation, whereas younger people, and actually I stay in part because I'm getting a lot from my institution. I have that pension, which is something that my institution will give back to me as a reward for my long-term tenure there. But Gen Z won't get that from their employer. There are no more pensions like that. And the institution really won't take care of Gen Z the way that mine took care of me. So they are also not willing to give as much to their institution. They need job flexibility, both from we have 401ks now, but they also need flexibility. They want to do other things in their lives. They won't just do more work for compensation. And interestingly enough, I'm seeing it even within groups. For example, in my cardiac group, we're short-staffed now, and traditionally if people were short-staffed, we would pay more to have people do extra call and things like that. And the older part of the group said, yeah, we'll do that. That seemed like a reasonable transaction. But the younger people say, no, we need the time for our family, for our lives, for our home, and work-life balance. And in fact, that's something that an older generation will think of as a negative, but it's not. Millennials are about 22 to 38 or 40 years old. And certainly for a long time were described as either lazy or just all they cared about was their self. But I'm going to convince you that that's absolutely not true. They are the most educated generation ever. So those that have been around for a while might remember these magazine covers that were very critical of the millennials. All they care about is, taking selfies and looking at themselves. But I think that's a deep misunderstanding of what's going on. And there was a fun article in the Times, I think it was in December, which was the 37-year-olds are afraid of the 23-year-olds that work for them. So this is a really interesting, I don't want to call it a rift, but there's a transition between the millennials and the Gen Zs, because the Gen Zs want different things than the millennials want. This was a nice quote from that article as Gen Z arrives, and I've seen a little bit of this. For example, a Gen Z worker questioning why they should work for an 8-hour day when they're able to get their work done in 6 hours. At a biotech venture, entry-level staff members delegated tasks to the founders. And I will certainly think about, my interactions, whether it's with medical students or residents, and a medical student who I've never met before addresses me by my first name, and I'm sort of taken aback by that because that's not how I was raised or what I did. But in fact, you have to understand the different generations, how they communicate and how they think about communication. And rather than bemoaning the fact that they're not more respectful, millennials are adapted to instant communication. They like emojis. I showed you some before because they express emotions. And I use emojis. I have 2 daughters in their 20s, and they've taught me a lot about communication. But, and there's really aren't boundaries on social media. In fact, it's quite interesting. I think you all probably see now that there's quite a trend now around, for example, email responses where people put an email signature saying, you may be receiving this email at midnight, but I don't expect you to respond outside of office hours. I haven't quite done that yet, but in fact, I understand that because the constant communication can be exhausting. Social media, of course, is extremely important. There's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We know the challenges that have heard with those. I guess now it's Telegram. But these are constant sources of communication. In fact, but one of the things that's stressful is they provide quantitative feedback. So recently, here's the UCSF anesthesia Twitter feed. There are, looks like 2,500 followers, but our arch rival to the south, we're frenemies with them. But the Stanford anesthesiology Twitter feed has 5,700. Well, of course, it's Stanford, and they're very techie there. But in fact, this is something that people look at and they sort of compare each other. But I will tell you that you can't ignore social media if you're a modern department. Certainly, again, we're trying to recruit residents, and we need to be on social media. So otherwise, we will get fewer applicants, as I'll show you. The way that we evaluate each other, certainly the way we evaluate residents and students, is a little bit like when my kids played soccer. We didn't keep score, right? Because everybody was a winner. And so you would get participation trophies. And here this one on the right says, you have legs and came near the ball once or twice award. And I think a lot of us in my generation would roll our eyes and saying, well, how is anybody going to learn about competition and things like that? But in fact, that's where we are now. And you have to understand that that's the expectation. And the people that you're working with that are now in the workforce were brought up that way. I think one of the most important things, and again, really highlighted in the pandemic, is the differences between childbearing and child rearing. People get married and have children later in life, but most importantly, men are expected to participate in child rearing. I'll show you our leave policy is essentially equal between the child-bearing parent and the child-rearing parent. And do you have a good policy for that? that there still remains, however, significant disparities between men and women in what the expectations are at home. And you have to understand that, because half of our residents are women, a little bit more than half. More than half of the younger faculty that I've recruited are women, and they join the anesthesia department. They've been in medical school and residency and fellowship, and they often then is when they start to have their families. And so it's very interesting. This was an article in JAMA about disparities. And so, who's working full time? Well, in year one, everybody with both male and female were working full time. By the time you got to year 6, 21 out of 21 males were still working full time, but only 19 out of 31 female identifying as female. So there was a 28, the odds ratio of not working full time was 28 times. And then also working full time but considering part time was the same. So in fact, there are disparate effects on the females or women, those identifying as women in our workforce. And in fact, it was even more so in those that had families, with working full-time, men working 70% and only 19% of women. And so, and family was the reason for this. And so this is essentially a disparity. And it was from the Annals of Internal Medicine. And the question was, how much time do you spend on domestic responsibilities? And whether you're married men or married women, a significant difference in the women are still expecting to take care of those issues in the home. And as much as I really tried not to be that person in my own marriage of 30 plus years, I know that I still am, and I have a long ways to go with that. But you have to recognize the impact of that on your workforce. I thought a really interesting question that was also in the Annals of Internal Medicine article was it's great. Who stays home when your kid is sick? Or how about who stays home when daycare closes because of a COVID case? And there's no comparison. If you looked at overall, 13%, 46% of men said that their female spouses stayed home, and 12% of women said that their male spouses would stay home. So clearly, again, a disparity between who is expected to stay home when something happens, when your child is sick or can't go to daycare. Well, of course, this, as we know, our residents have crushing debt. This is now a few years old, and it's not unusual at all for me to communicate with one of our residents who can have up to $400,000 in debt from medical school. And this very much guides their decision-making, and you have to understand that. And when you roll your eyes at the fact that they just seem to want to get paid a lot of money, you don't understand the amount of debt that they have. And as an aside, there are great loan repayment programs. If you work in any sort of a governmental institution like a nonprofit university or other public institution, there are great repayment programs right now, and I recommend that you look at those. So how do you mentor millennials? Now, we talked about those that felt like they were cared for in the workplace, wanted to stay, and they didn't want to leave. And so there are, the idea of, and this shows sort of the myth versus reality, they're not impatient, they're efficient. And so you need to avoid inertia and embrace innovation. They're not lazy, they're balanced. So you have to provide the ability for them to have a balanced workload. And now that we've identified remote work as being possible, there are almost no entities that will survive if they don't allow some remote work. Now, of course, we have to be in the operating room, but in most places, not 100% of the job is not in the operating room. There may be some component of academic time or administrative time, and you have to allow the ability to do that remotely. And I think we will live with that for a very long time. It's hard to imagine anything positive coming out of the pandemic, but perhaps that's one thing that will come from that. So how do you make things work at work? Well, there are 4 recommendations: making work meaningful, giving clear direction, be transparent, and have a full life approach to work. And this is very much based more on what's known about working with millennials. So comes from Manny Pardo, my vice chair for education. So what's his advice for the faculty, and what's his advice for the residents? Share your vision with the residents, tell the residents, if you don't know, ask something. One of the things that this misperception that perhaps there's some laziness, it's not. They will work harder than anyone, but they want to know what is expected of them and what is it that they should do. And rather than being frustrated that somebody hasn't done something, say something, and they will do it, and they will do it again the next time. You need to give clear direction to this generation. So be explicit about it. Don't accept unsatisfactory work. Try to show them how to do this well. Transparency is essential, and certainly something that I've learned as a leader. You must be transparent. Everything we do, I try to make transparent, whether it's choices for leadership positions. Our finances are very transparent. In my faculty meetings, I show all the finances. There's nothing to hide. The money belongs to the group, whether you're in a private practice group or you're an academic department, you need to share it. Don't sweep bad news under the rug. People can hear it. Again, we've learned about that in the pandemic, that when you're honest and open, you will be better off and people will trust you as a leader. And again, take a full life approach to work. What is the expectation that you have for people when they're not in the workplace? And I think what's been really fascinating as and I'm sure you all people are returning to the office, is how do we do that well? There was a large number of, I guess, what I would call middle managers whose job was made up of walking around the office workplace and making sure that people were working. So they would sit at their computers and either work or pretend to work, and they were evaluated on that basis. But in fact, that's meaningless. What matters is what is the work product that people do, and can you, and some people do it in different ways. They might do some at home, some at work, and you have to trust them. And in fact, almost every study that's been done looking at remote work has found as much, if not more, productivity when you allow people to do this, when you don't force them into time-consuming commutes to and from work. People have more time with family, maybe more time for exercise or just socializing. And in fact, that's really important. You need robust communication tools. You can't ignore social media. So I again recognize my skill in social media is quite limited. But I'm a large department and I have a communications director now. Actually, we have two. And so if yesterday somebody told me they got a grant, I just forward it to the communication director, and the communication director then creates the content. They have great images like you see here, and then they will put it up on Twitter or Instagram, and they will allow people to see that. And that's really an expectation now. And this is, in fact, how you support the people in your group or your department, because they want to share and they want to celebrate this good news. It's somebody gets in a promotion, an advancement, they win an award, they get a grant. You need to share that. And that's all part of trying to create a positive environment at work. Interestingly, before the pandemic, we didn't have a Twitter account. We would get about 700 applicants. And I know there are other factors for this, but after establishing our Twitter account, we had more than 1,000. And certainly now, as we are probably entering an era of where we will just no longer have in-person residency interviews, it's highly unlikely. I'm not a program director, but that's sort of what I hear. I think that this is going to be increasingly important. And in fact, we have had a more diverse group of applicants to our program than we had when we could only essentially interview people, particularly when you're on the West Coast where there are fewer programs. You end up interviewing people that have the resources that can afford to fly to the West Coast and interview in programs that have geographic distance between each other. So I think that's very positive. I think something that we've done well at UCSF, as a leader, a young faculty member comes to you and tells you that they're pregnant. Of course, you say congratulations, and I used to say, oh, well, now, wow, what's going to happen now? This is going to be expensive. We're going to have to find more coverage. So what we did at UCSF, I think, was very innovative, where there is now a tax on every department. We pay a tax, 1.5% payroll tax to the dean's office. And we pay that regardless of how many women are in the faculty, how many have children. But in fact, we pay that. And then when they go on childbearing leave for 3 months, now for childbearing is also 3 months, then the dean's office pays their entire base salary. So in fact, if you don't have people that are taking advantage of this, you're just paying this tax for no reason. It's made a really big difference. Something else you can do to help people is we can stop the clock. So we have promotions that are basically on a time basis when you're evaluated. So when you're out, you can quote unquote stop the clock so that you're not falling behind those. You're being compared to people that have worked as long as you have, but not just were hired at the same time. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about well-being, particularly lately. This is from Maslow, who has informed us a lot about burnout. And these are the 7 core needs for well-being that you can see here. I'm not going to read them to you. These are some of the things that we've tried to do is create not just, yes, we have nice events with food and things like that, but trying to really have meaning in people's work. So, for example, we have clubs that we've established for residents, faculty, and staff, whatever you want, whether you're interested in global health or basic science or diversity, equity, and inclusion, that you can join these clubs and try to develop a community around these interests. And we will provide some funding for those, perhaps now again, some food or drink. We try to develop individual development plans for each faculty member, and it's a wide range, but it allows us to have a framework. So either I do it or my division chiefs will do that so that people understand what's the plan for their career and how are they going to be successful in this job so they don't start looking elsewhere for a job. We make it easy to find what are all the things that are going on so people can identify their interests. Can they get involved in education or education research or other things? So one of the important positions that we've established is I have an associate chair for diversity, equity, and inclusion. For well-being. We also have one for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Gina Sinsky, who is a real powerhouse, also is the vice chair for the ASA Committee on Well-being. And she has really dedicated her academic career to this. And she looks at academic medicine and how do we, while we always center clinical excellence, what are the other areas that make people want to go into academics? Why do people go into academics? These are the 3 pillars of everything that we do. But different people have different balances between those. And so how can we support those people? Academic practice is different and it's got less compensation. So you must find a way to let people have rewards. And we do find those people. Occasionally we lose people, particularly right now where so much compensation being offered in the community practices. But how can you make this a lifelong pursuit so that it's satisfying? Can you pay enough? You have to pay something it can't be head-to-head competitive, but it is enough for them to have a reasonable life, but then offer the really rich rewards that we have. But you need to measure how you're doing. We use what's called a Net Promoter Score, which is a survey we're doing it right now. We do it every year. The idea is that there's a score from 0 to 10. 9s and 10s are promoters. 7 and 8 are sort of passive. But as you can see, the detractors have more power, everybody from 0 to 6. And we measure that every year. Now, one of the questions we asked is, what do you think of as UCSF as a place to do clinical work or just work overall? When I started as chair, it was bad. We were at minus 57. And now, basically, as of this year, we're essentially at 0. That's not great. 0 is nothing to be proud of, but we've made a lot of progress. And I'm proud of that work that we've done. But of course, it's been done with a whole lot of help from a number of people. When we have free text comments, and it's important that you identify who are they talking about. For example, do you feel supported by leadership? Well, who do you mean leadership? And so now we've made it more granular. Is it the dean, CEO? Is it the division chief or chair, me? Is it your medical director? And so you can identify who is it that you don't really feel supported by. And mostly actually between, I'm doing okay as chair, 70% agree, and about 17% are neutral, only 15% disagree, whereas they're much less interested and they're concerned that particularly the CEO is pushing us to expand too fast and there's too much work to do that we can't keep up with. And of course, you cannot separate wellness from diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're doing some really nice work. We're trying to integrate those two components. And those two our two vice chairs are working very closely together, Odie Ahe. And they've actually, what I'm particularly proud of, have turned that into a real academic pursuit with multiple presentations and publications. Now, we have much work to do. For those, even at where we are in a relatively liberal part of the world, if you ask that same question and you look at it by gender, particularly those that are transgender or non-binary are having a very difficult time. For males, it goes from plus 21. For those that are transgender or non-binary, it's minus 67. So you must be aware of that, and you have to focus efforts on that. So really, I recommend reading about Churchill, who had to communicate with those in London during the Blitz when the Nazis were bombing every single day, every night. And the way he would communicate was just very straightforward. You tell the truth. You tell exactly what's happening, but hopefully finish whatever you're saying with a positive view of the future. So how do you balance your well-being initiatives? How do you empower your people to advance well-being? How do you do it in an academic way? That's what we're trying to do now so that we can really share best practices. You need to start early. You need to be consistent. And we have an actual well-being I'll refer you to that Kevin Thornton, Gina Sinsky published so that you can understand more of some of the things that we're doing, particularly within our residency program. We've even received funding from the NIH to focus on wellness in our research group. We've established a clear structure within the department that allows us, and we have to have invested money in this, but I think the money comes back manyfold as you don't have turnover of faculty. So I will, running out of time here, but you need to integrate everything that we do as a department, whether you're in an academic practice or non-academic practice, with an intense focus on well-being. And if you do so, you'll be able to retain your people. You will improve their lives. And we're now starting to work with our nursing and surgery colleagues to do the same thing so that we are aligned with how we're focusing on well-being as a team. So I will finish up with this, which is the aging physician, a quote from Osler, nothing sadder than the professor who doesn't know when to quit. I will know when to quit when my time comes, but as you know, performance declines, particularly after age 60, but even starting at age 30. Unfortunately, you can measure that. And I'll leave you with this thought from Gurpreet Dhaliwal, who's at our VA, which is called, he thinks that every generation is the greatest generation. Every generation is more educated, they have more challenges, but in fact, we're very fortunate to have the next generation coming along, and every generation will be better. So I will leave you with that. Thank you very much for your attention.